My colleagues have said that the assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004 reduced mass public shootings. Take whatever number sales of AR-15 style weapons went up from 1994. If the assault weapons ban had any effect, how did it have an effect? Or because it was just a cosmetic ban. If the assault weapons ban had any effect, how did it have an effect? The ownership and sales and transfer of AR-15 style weapons went up during that period. So I would just close by saying, you can't make a good law by putting 6 bad laws together. It's not going to work. It will infringe on our constitutional rights, and the Democrats don't seem to care. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for
To care. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson of Georgia seek recognition?
Since we lost 21 souls in Uvalde, Texas. You know, it's been 91 souls in Uvalde, Texas. 19 children and 2 teachers. We can't ignore the problem, which is out of control gun violence in America. We must lead. We must act now. Acting now will take courage. Each of us on this committee should call forward of courage, like the courage that was on display last week by those brave Border Patrol agents who put their lives at risk to stop in Uvalde. I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, can you put aside your thirst for raw power, stand up for our kids and against the NRA? My friend, history will not forget those politicians and the phony patriots that more about maintaining their grip on power and serving the interest of the NRA than they did about protecting our kids from out-of-control gun violence. Columbine, Sandy Hook, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Virginia Tech, UC Santa Barbara. The list goes on and on. And none of these heinous atrocities moved Congress to act. We must not let Uvalde fail. Our constituents need to know that we hear from them. The fact of the matter is that more than 311,000 students have experienced gun violence at school since Columbine. This violence, this carnage, cannot be what America is all about. And the time for minor reforms, legislative action to stop the murders of our children. Let's do something. In the name of Columbine, let's crack down on straw purchasers. In the name of Sandy Hook, Pulse Nightclub and Bump Stock. In the name of Sandy Hook, Pulse Nightclub, El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, let's ban high-capacity magazines. In the name of Marjorie, Buffalo, and Uvalde, let's raise the age of purchase to 21 years of age. This misguided pledge of allegiance to guns and yes, to the NRA. It must end, and it must end now, not tomorrow, not next year. For the people of the United States demanding meaningful, effective action, let's pass the Protecting Our Kids Act, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
I move respect the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Anytime we address gun violence, we should also address the state of affairs of our society. We should address crime and mental health. We must also address the family unit, forging the future of our society. Look at the story of the young man who did so much damage in Uvalde, Texas. None of the attention from this body, and the knee-jerk reaction is to always punish law-abiding citizens for the sins of the few? The answer is always to place more restrictions on the masses instead of hold accountable. The problem is not being addressed today. The majority, instead of working in good faith across the aisle to find real solutions to these problems, are now here talking of the bill that does little of that. This bill ignores the real mental health crisis in the country. It ignores the countless failures by the FBI and local jurisdictions to act on actionable information. It ignores how the defund the police movement influenced school districts across the US to rid themselves of school resource officers and police. It ignores trying to replace the family by withholding information from parents about their own children. This social experiment going on in our schools and our society is contributing to this mental health crisis, the deterioration of family values, and our skyrocketing violent crime rates. The question was posed by the lady, what have we taught our children? It is a very good question, and it's not being answered today. Unconstitutionally changing the age from the 18 to 21, as has been so clearly stated by others on the committee, does little to address the root causes I've described. Neither is creating a gun owner database, IRS, one of the provisions 6 in this bill. After all, the IRS has not had a great track record of keeping confidential information secure, has it? As often is done, only gets some talking points. Real solutions require reaching across the aisle and addressing all of these issues, tragedies to try and take away our rights and eventually have to be struck down by the courts. And I really think that the majority should be honest here today with the American public, and you should come clean. Oppose the amendment, which is what you really want, which is to repeal the Second Amendment to the Constitution, because that is really what is afoot and has been over the decades, this robust argument here in our country for a long time. Come clean, tell the American people what you really want to do, Mr. Chairman. And I would just close by this. Uzziah Garcia has been mentioned a couple times during this hearing. God bless that young man. He rest in peace, along with all the others that perished in Uvalde. But I would also cite Uzziah Garcia's uncle, who said, do not politicize this before all the facts are known about what went on at that Uvalde school. With that, if I have any colleagues that would like time to do it.
I'd like you to yield to me if you wouldn't mind. I'm a colleague.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Wow.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this markup during recess so that we can advance the Protecting Our Kids Act. This is life-saving legislation. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill, and I'm proud to support it today in committee. As the youngest member of this committee, I need to address my Republican colleagues, generations of young people whom Republicans have condemned to grow up in fear that they will be gunned down at school. When I was just 11 years old, something that then seemed 2 students killed a teacher and 12 of their classmates at Columbine High School. I was afraid. All of us were. But that by the time I was in high school, nothing like the shooting at Columbine would ever. I never imagined that mass shootings, let alone school shootings, adults would step up. I never imagined that mass shootings, let alone school shootings, would become our new normal. Yet that is exactly what has happened. What was once unthinkable has come to feel, for many Americans, unstoppable. Since Columbine, more than 311,000 children have experienced gun violence. There were more school shootings last year than in any year since 1999, the year of Columbine. And there have been more than shootings this year already. The leading cause of death of American children is now gun violence. Behind the story of a person, often a child, who mattered. Before we even had time to grieve for the 10 people murdered by a white supremacist in home state, another gunman killed 19 children and 2 adults in Uvalde, Texas. 4 children are orphans because their mother made on the battlefront in Iraq or in Eastern Europe, but in the classroom. And their grieving father died of a heart attack thereafter. A girl, Nevaeh, heaven spelled backwards, is in eternal rest at the age of 10. A badge of honor has been awarded posthumously for heroism, but to a Girl Scout, murdered trying to call for help. To the parents who mourn and the children who fear, all you have to offer, and apparently the ridiculous idea of fewer school doors. My generation and the generations who have followed know that this epidemic of gun violence is not a choice you could make differently at any time, a choice between our lives and your guns. Time after time, we have given you a chance to do something. After Columbine, Parkland, and time after time, you have chosen to put your right to kill over our right to live. But your selfishness and your indifference have not killed our hope. Before, we believed that you might do what the people overwhelmingly support and help advance common sense gun violence legislation. Now we know that it is up to us to save you. We did not choose this fight. We had our own dreams for our lives, the same as you did when you were kids, but we can't let you get away with this anymore. Enough of you telling us that school shootings are a fact of life when every other country like ours has virtually ended it. Enough of you blaming mental illness and then defunding mental health care. And enough of your thoughts and prayers. Enough. Enough. You will not stop us from advancing the Protecting Our Kids Act today. You will not stop us from passing, and you will not stop us there. If the filibuster obstructs us, we will abolish it. If the Supreme Court objects, we will expand it, and we will not until we have taken weapons of war out of circulation in our communities. Each and every day, we will do whatever it takes to end gun violence, whatever it takes. What we will do, not fail the children of this country the way that you have failed us, the generations of Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, and Uvalde. I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back for our purposes. The gentleman from Ohio seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now we know. Now we know where they want to go. They just said it. End the filibuster. Get the Constitution. Now we know. Democrats blame guns. They criticize the NRA. They call Republicans names. But let's be honest. They've told us with the Second Amendment. Their real beef is with the Second Amendment. Think about what this bill does. Mr. Massey just outlined the 6 bills thrown into one. What this bill does, it tells law when you can get a gun, what kind of gun you can get, what accessories you can get for your gun, and where and how you have to store it in your own darn home. That's what this bill does. This is the start. We know it's the start because Ms. Jackson Lee, the first person to speak on their side, said this: we're not finished. This is just the beginning. Their goal is to get rid of the Second Amendment. Joe Biden said it the other day. Said he wants to ban 9mm handguns. Michael Moore said it last week. Time to repeal the Second Amendment. We know where the Democrats want to go, and they don't care about the Constitution. Mr. Bishop pointed that out just a few minutes ago. They know the age limit in this bill is unconstitutional. Last month, from the most liberal circuit in the country, said it's unconstitutional. They know the storage provisions are unconstitutional. The Heller decision said so. They don't care. Forget the Constitution. They want to change the country in so many dramatic ways. The gentleman from New York just talked about getting rid of the filibuster. We know they want to pack the court because the chairman of this committee introduced a bill 14 months ago to pack the court. And the worst of it, tragedies we have seen unfold around the country in the last couple weeks. Would not stop the would not stop the terrible events that we saw, wouldn't just said last week, hardening schools is not something President Biden wants. Last week, hardening schools is not something President Biden wants to happen, not something he believes in. I find that astonishing, but that's what she said. Stop the terrible events. It wouldn't harden schools, but it will sure take away the rights. But it will sure take away the rights of the American people who follow the law. It's so wrong. But it is part of the pattern we have seen. And again, as Mr. Bishop pointed out a few minutes ago, the proper respect for the Constitution and for decision circuit courts. Nope. We are so focused on taking away people's liberty. It's frightening to me when you put it all in context and you think about what the Democrats are trying to do to First Amendment liberties, now to Second Amendment liberties. This is what frightens the American people. And that's why we should vote this bill down. And we should come together as a bipartisan and what we can do to help make schools safe, make sure that people are properly trained there, make sure the facility is the way it needs to be. We're all for that, but we're not for taking away this. We're not for ending liberties, not for ending the Second Amendment like they want to do. Mr. Chairman, I would yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
I thank the ranking member. Quote, dismantle white supremacy in all aspects of our society. And that means moving funding away from police departments and toward programs that improve public safety by helping to of systemic inequality. The gentleman from New York, the gentleman who just told us who he is, and I believe him. Except what the gentleman from New York described is annihilating the Second Amendment without repealing it in the manner contemplated in the United States.
Would the gentleman yield?
Understand what we are up against, because he just
Would the
told
gentleman
us.
yield?
He just told us,
Will the gentleman from
and
Ohio
I believe
yield?
him. I yield back to Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
I wasn't aware that Michael Moore was a Democratic member of the House. For what purpose is the gentlelady from Washington?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we originally called this markup to make a vow to the families of the 21 people and 2 teachers who were murdered last week at the 27th school shooting this year. A vow to the families of the 10 people killed in a supermarket by an 18-year-old Buffalo, New York, just 2 weeks before Uvalde, Texas. A vow to the families of so many mass shootings who have channeled their anger and their grief into pushing for action to take life-saving measures by passing legislation for common sense, necessary life-saving gun reforms, insanity of mass shootings that plagues our country. And yet before funerals have been held for those who died in Uvalde, America experienced another at the St. Francis Medical Building in Tulsa, Oklahoma. People who were parents, at least 4 people died. People who themselves were working, people who were parents who left behind children, people who should be alive today. Reports from the scene detail the shooter carrying 2 guns, one an automatic rifle, like the one used in the Uvalde massacre, but just yesterday, carrying those 2 guns through the medical buildings before the shooting began. And because of Oklahoma's hospital personnel were unable to do anything before the shooter began his rampage. And while we don't know the details, let me remind you that Republicans in their never-ending increase the number of guns on our streets and in our schools, passed laws in Oklahoma so that no permit is needed to purchase a firearm from a private individual, no waiting period is required, and no firearm registration is required in the state. In Oklahoma, anyone over the age of 21 can openly carry a firearm, including an AR-15. Without a license, weapons that can cause mass devastation are subject to less common sense safety measures than cars or motorcycles. The children of Uvalde are children. The parents in Buffalo and Oklahoma are all of our parents. This is our responsibility, and it doesn't have to be this way. Today, we have a chance to refuse to allow our schools and our supermarkets, our hospitals and our theaters, our public places turned into war zones where children hide terrified or in closets, or doctors in medical facilities don't know if they are going to save a life or have their own taken away. Do not tell me that the answer to this is more guns on the streets, or to militarize our schools or our theaters or our hospitals with metal detectors and cops. Do not talk about taking away fundamental freedoms when what we are doing, sensible reforms, is taking away the fundamental freedom for children to go to school and play and live. And don't tell me this is just about mental health. We certainly have mental health challenges that we have to respond to, but countries around the world have similar mental health challenges, but no other modern wealthy country has these mass shootings. What sets us apart, sadly, is the enormous number of guns and lack of regulation around guns, and most importantly, the lack of political will from Republicans to respond to these mass shootings. Other countries have had a major mass shooting. They responded, and it has worked. In March of 1996, Great Britain experienced and their teacher and injured 15 others. And in response, the British Parliament and injured 15 others. And in response, the British Parliament banned high caliber pistols. Since then, there has been not a single shooting in the UK. 6 weeks later, in Australia, and the third worst in the world occurred in Tasmania, killing 35 people and wounding 23. Australia passed sweeping reforms, including banning nearly rifles and shotguns and launching a program to buy back over 600,000 firearms. And since then, there has been only one mass shooting in Australia. Other countries have responded to action that effectively wiped away mass shootings. And meanwhile, the United States makes up 4% of the global population, but close to 15% of firearm deaths worldwide. So know what works. We know what works. We know that what we need to do is to pass this bill and say yes to saving lives for our families. Let's do what is right.
The gentlelady yield back.
I do.
Does Mr. Stube seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
In the filibuster, expand the court, take away your constitutional rights under the Second Amendment. Well, we just heard what the Democrats want to do here today and in the House in this coming week. On Monday, Biden stated a 9mm bullet blows the lung out of the body, and I quote, "So the idea of these high caliber weapons of there's simply no rational basis for it in terms of thinking about self-protection." So you can't protect yourself with a 9mm. I guess according to Biden, only a 22 round ammunition would be that statement. And said he supports a ban on the sale of assault weapons, which there's no such thing, and high capacity magazines. High capacity magazines. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Pelosi, speaking at an anti-gun rally in San Francisco, stated, "We will have a hearing markup on an assault weapon ban. Their plans and their intentions are clear. They want to take away law-abiding citizens of the arm of their choice, and don't let them fool you that they are not attempting to take away your ability to purchase handguns. They're using the magazine ban to do it. Last year in 2020, the Glock 19 was the highest sold handgun in the United States. It comes with a 15-round magazine. That gun would be banned. Right here in front of me, I have a Sig Sauer P226, 21-round magazine. This gun would be banned. Here's a 12-round magazine. This magazine would be banned under this current bill. It doesn't fit, because this gun was made a magazine. This gun would be banned under this bill. Here's a Sig Sauer 320. It takes a 20-round magazine. Here's a 12 that would be banned. It doesn't fit because it would be banned. This gun would be banned under this bill. Here's a gun I carry every single day to protect myself, my family, my wife. This is a XL Sig Sauer P365. Comes with a 15-round magazine. Here's a 7-round magazine, which would be less than what would be lawful under this bill if this bill were to. It doesn't fit. So this gun would be banned.
I hope the
under
gun is not loaded.
I'm at my house. I can do whatever I want with my guns.
Here's a
So
point of
that
order.
is exactly what I do. Now let's just take the policy objectives that they're trying to accomplish and look at the municipalities that have actually passed it. Maryland, Washington, D.C., Cook County, Illinois, all have some of the strict in the country, including limiting magazines to only 10 rounds. By comparison, In Florida, there are significantly less restrictions and no limits on magazine size. So are these laws effective? Let's look at the homicide rates in major cities and anti-gun jurisdictions that have magazine bans.
Would the gentleman yield for a
The
question?
state of Florida, where we have freedom and the ability to carry whatever firearm we want.
Gentleman yield for a question?
Largest city by area in the state, in my state.
Would the gentleman yield for a question? Yes or no?
No, I'm trying to get my point across in the 2 minutes that I have left.
Gentleman won't yield.
Let me start back over, and I hope you give me my 10 or 15 seconds back that you just took. Jacksonville, Florida, the largest city by area in my state, the murder rate was more than half of DC or one, and you are 4 times lower, and it was 4 times lower than in Baltimore, Maryland. All jurisdictions that have a magazine ban, you're safer in the state of Florida where we don't have it. Florida, near my district, or in Orange County where Orlando is located, in 2021, you were roughly 3 times less likely to be murdered here in Florida, in Orange County, or in Tampa. They both have magazine bans. And you are a whopping 5 times less likely to be murdered than in Baltimore, Maryland, than in Tampa, Florida, or Orange County. Additionally, the state of West Virginia is instructed. West Virginia has some of the most gun-friendly laws in the country, including permitless carry, no magazine restrictions. For purposes of comparing apples to apples, West Virginia also faces some struggles, levels comparable to nearby Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Yet someone is 9 times less likely to be murdered, according to the most recent numbers in those jurisdictions. These anti-gun cities, particularly ones than in Baltimore, and approximately 5 times less, according to the most recent numbers in those jurisdictions. These anti-gun cities, particularly ones with magazine bans, have some of the highest crime rates in the country, and they are growing worse. These laws do nothing to stop crime. Here thinks they will actually stop mass shootings. This is a push to take away your right to carry whatever firearm you please to defend yourself. So I hope our colleagues in the Senate are paying attention. A magazine ban will not these type of handguns because they don't have the capacity to take such a small magazine. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for purposes of gentleman's recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just returned from travel visit with other governments in Europe who have been receiving Ukrainian refugees, who have been standing up to Russia. It was an important series of meetings, but every single meeting with expressions of sympathy and condolences and questions about how it is that the United States continues to have this horrific gun violence problem. I thought it would be important just to repeat what we've heard and to make clear what we're actually doing here. First of all, to the ranking member and to Mr. Bishop, I so resent being told that I don't all do, and you know it's not true. Yes, there's a Ninth Circuit decision. There are also other circuits who have come down the other way. And when you refer to Heller, I think it's important to point out Justice Scalia in the Heller decision when he said, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Who then went on exactly how. So let's at least be clear that what's happening here, first of all, is constitutional. Now let's talk about what we're trying to do. We already passed legislation to one's background to make sure you don't have a violent history. There's nobody who's watching this who thinks that if you have a violent history, you should be able to buy a firearm. That's just straightforward. That we already passed, and that's what the Senate needs to bring up and pass. And look at what's in this bill. Raise the age for purchasing a semi-automatic rifle from 18 to 21. Let's also acknowledge that in America, you can't buy a handgun unless you're 21. That somehow hasn't been brought up today. By the way, you also can't buy a drink and you can't buy tobacco unless you're 21 either, but you can go in a semi-automatic assault rifle, which, by the way, for every time someone sits in this meeting and says, well, nothing we're doing here would have prevented this. Well, actually, if we had a law that said you have to be 21, these 2 AR-15s would not have been purchased. So that's what the 18 to 21 is. Also, Florida, my own Florida, raise a gun to 21. It's a really important step that we can take. Also, we'll be voting, before I get back to this, we'll be voting 100 times to make sure that people with violent histories don't do harm to themselves or to others. Florida did that. We want we want gun trafficking and straw purchases is because we don't want people to feel that they're able to simply bring guns to cities that don't have restrictions, don't buy them where they don't have restrictions. We're tough on crime in this committee, right? We all ought to be supportive of cracking down on gun traffickers who put people's lives at risk. Safe storage of firearms. Look, if you have, my guess is for every one of my colleagues on this committee who owns a firearm, you store it safely. But shouldn't everyone, if they have a child in their house, have to store their firearm safely? That's what this bill does. Bump stocks. Let's remember what bump stocks are. Bump stocks in Las Vegas allowed the shooter to fire off his gun as to do it more rapidly, to do it almost as a fully automatic. Well, President Trump wanted to get rid of those. We're getting rid of them here. Everybody ought to be supportive of that. And then finally, on high capacity magazines, all we're doing is limiting, and we're not banning guns. We're not taking anyone's guns away. We're not taking anyone's magazine away either. We're limiting it. And you know why? Because when a shooter goes into a school or goes anyplace else where there are mass shootings, which is everywhere, and has to reload, it provides an opportunity for someone to stop him and stop the killing. That's what with this. Look, I completely agree. We ought to be working together on school safety issues. We ought to pass the Luke and Alex School Safety Act. We ought to pass the Eagles Act. But this isn't just about school. Horrific mass shootings that happen everywhere. We ought to pass Jamie's law that my constituent, Fred Guttenberg, who lost his daughter, Jamie, has worked so hard on to require background checks on it can do. And finally, when Governor Abbott says that there's a problem getting access to mental health care, we should surge mental health care professionals into every underserved community in our country. You should all work to get that done. This is a reasonable piece of legislation that will help to save lives. It's important that we do it. We owe it to every family who continues to suffer and we continue to. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your bringing this bill forward for markup, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Ms. Deming seek recognition? Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My colleague from North Carolina had the audacity to talk about bullies. Well, bullies showed up on January 6th and trampled all over the United States Constitution. I think bullies are trying to take away a woman's right to choose. I think bullies all over this country are involved in gerrymandering and trying to suppress the right to vote. So if you want to talk about bullies, let's talk about those things. You know, it has been very interesting discussion. As a former police chief, a former crisis negotiator, the commander of the critical incident management team, I how to describe or begin to understand why people who have the power and the opportunity to do good, to make a difference, just refuse to do so, come hell or high water. And Lord knows we have seen hell come over and over again, whether it was Columbine, Sandy, Las Vegas, El Paso, all our churches, Mother Emanuel, Sutherland Springs, and our movie theaters, our synagogues, grocery stores, the Pulse that just happens to be in my district, Parkland, Uvalde. And as my colleague said, before we can even get this hearing started today, a hospital in Oklahoma. That law enforcement is expected to do something to respond quickly and enforce the laws. Well, guess what? We as members of Congress are responsible for writing those laws, and we have watched hell come time and time again, over and over again, and simply have failed the American people. Well, I don't know about my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but I am certainly not proud of that. Mr. Chairman, is there anyone really on this is there really one who really believes that it's okay for an 18-year-old to purchase an assault weapon or an assault style that can do unimaginable damage to the human body and also be able to purchase thousands of rounds of ammunition? Is there anyone in this committee who really believes that that is okay? The Ammunition Background Check Act, known as Jamie's Law, which my colleague mentioned, Jamie was a young woman with her whole future ahead of us who lost her life high school. Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to not wait another day. And let's just sit back and see who be killed next. Who's going to die next in a mass shooting? Just as we expect law enforcement to do something, comes responsibility too. The American people are expecting us to do something. Let's don't sit back and wait for the next child in this country to die in their classroom. Mr. Chairman, I believe that there is no country with a greater ability to protect our children in the United States. And there's been several people talking about Florida, talking about Parkland and laws that Florida led legislation, who thought that children dying at Parkland was ridiculous and shameful and appalling. And it was that legislation that imposed a 3-day waiting period, and that legislation or legislators that passed red flag laws. Somehow, all of the politics that we see played today, they remembered, as we talk about constitutional rights, they remembered the rights of our children, not to by gunfire in the classroom. But you know what? They don't spend all of their time in the classroom. They go to church, they go to the balls, they go to the movie theater. We're accountable for acts of omission and commission. May heaven help us. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purposes, Mr. Bucksey, Gregory?
Like the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it is terribly sad what's happened in this country in the last few weeks. And unlikely, I was a federal prosecutor when Columbine happened and was part of a group that went into the school the day after. And what I saw was terrible. I had in school and it impacted me and those with me and frankly, all of America. Living in Colorado, I've also experienced the the Aurora Theater shooting up close, and certainly recently the Boulder grocery store shooting. But one thing I've learned from law enforcement being involved in these particular shootings and also observing what's happening our country, these laws will not help the situation. And frankly, I will vote against the bill that has been proposed. A problem when we tell the American people that we have solutions, and we don't have easy solutions for what's happening right now. We need to hold hearings. We need to examine the underlying causes. There are some ideas in terms of hardening schools and some other ideas. Gun-free school zones have been a failure. Gun-free zones have been a failure. The Aurora Theater shooting, there were a dozen premieres of the Batman movie the night of the Aurora Theater shooting within a few miles of where that shooting occurred. That shooting occurred in a gun-free and the other premieres were not in gun-free zones. Did the shooter take that into account? I don't know. But it's clear that disarming Americans is not a way to use gun violence. We've seen assault weapons bans. The assault weapon ban that was in place, the federal assault weapon ban that was in place for 10 years, we saw a violent increase during that time. It did not reduce violent gun crime in America. These bills that have been presented, the Safe Storage Act, Ethan's Law, Safe Guns, Safe Home Stock, Keep Americans Safe Act, would not have prevented what happened in the last 3 shootings and many other shootings. We have a serious problem involving drugs, involving mental health in this country. We have gone the wrong direction in the last 40 or 50 years. We have become a less safe society generally. The gun for what's happening in America is small-minded. It is unfortunate that we can't come together as a group of well thought through legislators that want to deal with this problem, pointing the fingers at each other and saying, well, you're only doing this because you're trying to gain political points on the heels of a dangerous shooting. And then for you to tell us by the NRA, I voted against the NRA, I'll vote against the NRA when I think they're wrong. I'm representing my constituents. In rural Colorado, an AR-15 is a gun of choice for killing wherever they get to our chickens. It is a gun of choice for killing a fox. It is a gun that you control predators on your ranch, on your farm, on your property. Somehow we're going to deny access to, I think there are 20 million AR-15s in circulation in this country. It makes absolutely no, and it's unfortunate. I think that there are other answers. We've certainly in Colorado, we have discussed the possibility of incentivizing veterans, the military or discharged from the military to go into education and teach and be able to carry guns in a school as a team administrator, as a coach, trying to help to strengthen our system. I think we've got to get beyond the finger Republicans to strengthen our system. I think we've got to get beyond the finger pointing at this point. I think we've got to get to the point where we're holding hearings, and Republicans take the majority in November, that in January, we will start to hold hearings and come up with answers that are meaningful, not answers where we tell the American, we're going to make sure that there's no guns in schools, so law-abiding citizens don't have guns in schools, but criminals do. We want to make sure that we get to the bottom line of a very complex and very serious problem that this country, what we do in the future. It's obvious to me that right now that's not what's intended, and it's sad. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? The gentleman from California seek recognition.
Strike the last. 19 kids are dead. 19 children are dead. And so to my Republican colleagues, I ask, who are you here for? Are you here for our, or are you here for the killers? Because if you were here for the kids, you would do all you could to protect the next school shooting that's about to happen. And we know what's going to happen. You would vote to raise the age on purchasing an assault rifle. You would vote to ban high-capacity magazines. You would vote to require safe storage. And you would vote to address ghost guns, which are ravaging communities across America. But if you're here for the killers, you would do everything to make it easier for the next school shooting to happen. And Mr. Jordan, to say we are trying to dramatically change the country, if trying to make sure that no more kids are put in the ground with a Superman coffin means dramatically change the country, guilty. That's why we're here. Kids are going in the ground today, and you call that trying to dramatically change the country. Why aren't you trying to dramatically change the number of dead kids going into the ground, Mr. Jordan? Who are you here for, the kids or the killers? My Republican colleagues are here for carnival games. They say it's about mental health. Okay, we try and fund mental health. They say it's about schools. We try and fund the schools, fund the teachers. They vote against it. They say it's about policing. $300 million in the American Rescue Plan for community policing. They all voted against the police. If they listened to the police, they'd listen to the major cities' chiefs who have called for background checks, red flag laws, banning bump stocks, and banning high-capacity magazines. My favorite, it's about the family. We need to address the family issues in America. But we don't want to help feed a family. We're going to make it harder for kids to live on food stamps. We don't learn. We're going to go after teachers in America. We don't want to give them jobs. We're going to vote against the infrastructure and jobs bill. We have no problem crafting laws to take away a woman's right to make her own health care decision. That law must work. No problem going after laws to ban drugs. There's plenty of laws on the books to the person. Laws don't work when you have evil in our country. That's what they tell us. And then they tell us that we're in a country where you have violent video games, mental health problems, schools that can't be secure, too many gun-free zones, and their solution to that is to put more of the most dangerous weapons into that mix. That's insane. They're also out of touch with the overwhelming majority in America. An organization called 97% just put out a poll that said among gun owners, and they only polled gun owners, 86% support background checks, that support safe storage, 67% support red flag laws. Those are gun owners. So who are you here for? Our kids or the killers? I'm borrow. She's a Moms Demand Action leader in the San Francisco Bay Area. And last week, after I convened a meeting among my constituents and people like Fred Guttenberg and Dr. Joe Session at Johns Hopkins, Alex Navarro told my constituents that her 6-year-old daughter, after Uvalde, after seeing said to her, "Mom, what picture are you going to use for me? What picture are you going to use for me?" That's what children are asking their parents across America, because they don't believe they're going to come out alive. What picture are you going to use for me? We're supposed to be here for the kids. And so to my colleagues today who flew in town, came to work, got ready to argue, why did you come here at all? Why did you come here at all? If you're not here for the children, why don't you go to the funeral of the killer? Because that's the only celebrated. We're here to get things done and protect our kids. What's your job? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, Mr. Gorman seek recognition?
Back the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that it's very effective for the children to have and accuse Republicans of being complicit in murder, and that we put our others' right to live to infer by rhetorical supposed here for the gunman is an outrage. How dare you? You think we don't have things that you're doing and you're trying to do to America? We've seen the Democrats control the major cities that have the worst murder rates. They'll kill. Your ideas have been shown to killed. Are you here for the murderers in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in these other major cities, wanting to do nationally what is being done by Democrats in those big cities? We care about people. We care about their lives. And a lot trivialized. We care deeply. How dare you? How dare you, you arrogant people, attributing murder to those to stop it? Because we've seen what your ideas do. They create more murder. Okay, let's look. Rochester, New York. These are cities that the all-time high homicide rates in 2021. This is what you're shooting for, apparently, figuratively speaking. Rochester, New York, they had a record homicide, not that big of a city. Philadelphia, 524 last year. And by the way, all of these are Democrat mayors. Louisville, Kentucky hit a homicide rate. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Austin, Texas, Indianapolis, St. Paul, Portland, Albuquerque, Tucson, Columbus, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, New York, are all Democrat ideas. They control. They've done so many of the things that Democrats in this committee want to do. We're not alleging you don't care. We're just ideas have gotten people killed, not saved lives, for heaven's sake. And then you want to be arrogant and accuse us of murder and of not caring. And if you could just possibly get off any kind of arrogant stepladder that allows you to look down on us and look back historically. Thomas Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention, but he said in a letter, if I could change one thing, it would be to be on file for a year before they're voted on, because he understood the mistakes that are made when you, so that we can save lives and keep people from being killed. For a president in Franklin Roosevelt that on D-Day led the country, in a 6 to 8 minute prayer for our troops. And now we had a President Uvalde and he used God's name in vain. Most of us would consider it. It was used as an interjection, not as a source from whom to beg for wisdom, like this country did for me. Since the 60s, we really started having these mass shootings. Perhaps there was something in the 60s, maybe some Supreme Court decisions that gave rise in school. It's whatever you think feels good. Well, it's time to get common sense back and to look historically about where people are being record rates, and don't repeat that like the Democrats are trying to do. Let's do common sense things that will save lives. I'm out of time, so you'll back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I do want to respond first to Mr. Gomer, and I'm sorry that he and many of his colleagues didn't think it was important enough to be here. But I did want to respond to his allegation that Philadelphia's homicide rate
the gentlelady
is...
yield
No, I will
so
not.
I can explain
I will
why
not
I
yield.
couldn't get there. My
The gentlelady does not
Time
yield.
is-
Yield. The time is
I
yours.
waited for
I wanted
hours.
to
Gentlelady
respond.
does not yield.
I wanted to respond to Mr. Gomert's allegation that Philadelphia's homicide rate is the fault of Democratic leadership in that city. Apparently, the Commonwealth's Republican legislature for decades has blocked city leadership from passing the types of common sense gun safety laws we are considering. To the broader question, like most Americans, I am sickened and sick to death of the gun carnage we experience in this country every single day. Sit idly by, watching preventable tragedies play out over and over again, day after day, year after year. Whether the children and teachers slaughtered in Texas last week, in Tulsa last night, or Buffalo the week before, or the more than a dozen people gunned down in Philadelphia during the Memorial Day weekend. In cities and towns across the country, we are people whose lives have been cut short, including children whose lives had barely begun. We are not helpless here. We can change this. We can pass gun violence prevention laws that save lives. All it takes is political courage, a willingness to put Americans' lives above gunmaker profits. Over to the Columbine shooting, I rejected helplessness and hopelessness to organize members of my community to join safety and ceasefire PA and candidates who are willing to advocate for gun safety laws. Pass common sense who are willing to advocate for gun safety laws. And in 2018, I came to Congress along with many of my colleagues, sent here by our pass common sense gun violence prevention legislation. And I'm not alone. The majority of my constituents and fellow Americans have decided enough is enough as well. They are demanding and state lawmakers. Gun violence is a big, multifaceted problem, but doing nothing is not a solution. The profits of gun manufacturers cannot be worth more than the lives of our teachers, our doctors, our seniors. The Protecting Our Kids Act will address some of the key enabling conditions for gun violence and make changes that are constitutional, that will make and that are supported by law enforcement. This is not about repealing the Second Amendment or taking away the guns of responsible gun owners. I want to echo Mr. Deutsch in reminding our colleagues of Justice Scalia's said that, like the other rights secured by the Bill of Rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not without limits. Or as other justices have noted, the Constitution is not a suicide. This bill before us is not about being pro-gun or anti-gun. It's about desperately needing to stop gun violence. To my colleagues who oppose each and every common sense, insult Americans, our children, our teachers, or the memory of all those we have lost by offering thoughts and prayers with no action. Year after year, decade after decade. Faith without works is dead, and we are here to work. Do not insult Americans by offering hollow solutions like turning schools into armed fortresses when you won't us or lead from schools. Do not insult Americans by advocating to arm teachers and guidance counselors and librarians when many of our schools don't have enough money to hire guidance counselors or enough teachers. And do not insult Americans by saying that fortifying schools is the solution when our children and the rest of us have to face the prospect of gunfire on the way to or from school, market, or the hospital, or the movie theater, or our churches, mosques, and synagogues. I refuse to tell our children there's nothing we can do, that they must be sacrificial lambs to a twisted theory, amendment liberty that is decoupled from personal responsibility. Our children know as well as we do that something can be done. We know it in our guts. Our children deserve to, and we have the power to give our kids a more hopeful and bright future. This weekend, America's National Youth Poet Laureate, Amanda Gorman, offered us a hymn in which she, "We innocent never be lost." Mr. Chair, I yield back. Choose our children over chaos. May another innocent never be lost. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard some really outrageous and even very revealing things. Mr. Jones said several minutes ago that we Democrats are seeking to abolish the filibuster and expand and pack the Supreme Court. We'll do anything necessary, he said, and that's what we know this is about. President Joe Biden looked into a camera and said that he wants to ban 9mm handguns. This is one of the most widely purchased and used handguns by the citizens of this country. In 2018, retired liberal Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens called for the repeal of the Second Amendment. And in recent days, liberals in Hollywood and even on Capitol Hill have started once again. Our colleagues have made some outrageous claims here in this hearing today, been listening since it started. They claim, for example, that raising the purchasing age for semi-automatic will reduce school shootings. But as has been noted, this action has already been ruled unconstitutional by the liberal U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, no less, when they struck down imposing similar restrictions on gun purchases for 18 to 20-year-olds.
Would the gentleman yield
today,
for a moment?
I will not yield. Today, they've claimed that Republicans don't care about gun violence. We've heard this breathlessly outrageous. House Republicans have worked tirelessly to combat gun violence and have enacted meaningful laws to put more resources into mental health, to provide training for guidance counselors, to fund grants, while the other side was trying to defund it, and provide money to harden schools. As has been noted today, President Biden apparently is not in favor of that idea, and that just seems crazy. Today, Democrats have claimed that gun-free school zones promote school safety, but arming teachers and school administrators would mean well-trained adults would be at the ready to protect and the innocent children in their care. The depraved shooter in Buffalo a few weeks ago wrote in his manifesto, quote, "Areas where carrying a concealed weapon or outlawed or prohibited may be good." Yeah, obviously. And of course, tragically, the elementary school in Uvalde banned people from carrying firearms. Yesterday, I interviewed for my podcast, Pastor YJ. He's a pastor there on the ground who is ministering to the people of that West Texas community who have suffered from such unspeakable loss. His calming presence and clear conviction in national interviews with millions of Americans, because he has spoken to the root causes for all this. He has spoken to the root causes for all this modern violence and bloodshed. Moments ago, what we're seeing right now is the results of decades of decline with the secularization of America and absolutes and the breakdown of law and order. Of all this on young people in critical settings, in the culture at large, and of course in our schools. And it's an inevitable result of decisions that we've made in this culture. Yesterday, a New York Times survey, 4% of school administrators today say that students are suffering from anxiety and depression, and 88% report that students are having trouble managing their emotions. You know, it's hacking at the branches of evil, the one who's striking at the root. This hearing today was called for this hastily pulled together hodgepodge of Democrat bills that have been sitting on the shelf and will do nothing to solve the real problems. This is hacking at branches for the simple purpose of making a show, while the root problems remain unaddressed. That's what we should be working on. That's what we intend to work on. That's what we will work on, because retake the majority will address the root causes. I hope we can. God help us to do that. I'd like to yield my remaining time to Mr. Gomer if he desires that, to address the false claim that was just made about him. Are you still with us?
Yes, I am, and I appreciate my friend from Louisiana. I waited for hours at the DFW airport, but there were plenty. I'm not in D.C. But just like we've heard on so many other allegations, they're without basis, without knowledge. But one thing we've learned repeatedly, when Democrats accuse Republicans of things, whether it's colluding with Russia, it's often gaslighting and tells us more about what's in the conscience of users. And I would also remind my colleagues, I didn't know in 2016 But when the Democrats took the House floor, they obstructed an official session, which is a felony. And that's what many of January 6ers were charged with. I yield back.
Yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back for the purposes of gentleman's recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be remiss if I didn't respond, at least briefly, to my colleague. We have extended debates from time to time on the Constitution and our competing views about the constitutionality of different provisions, whatever see, which is apparently praising the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and taking a position that, of course, I've served on this committee long enough to remember my colleagues on the other side of the aisle complain year after year after year and making the case that simply because the Ninth Circuit had ruled something not mean as a dispositive matter that the statute in question was unconstitutional. But in any event, I'll digress. Mr. Chairman, I want to say—
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
I'll yield to the chairman, of course.
Yes, I simply want to point out that the so-called liberal Ninth Circuit that made that decision, the panel was composed of 2 Trump appointees who decided appointee in the minority, and other circuits have decided to the contrary. So talk about this so-called liberal Ninth Circuit is historical. But no, I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the chairman. I agree. I think the chairman makes a salient point. And again, apparently the new standard for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is that a singular panel decision from the final word on the constitutionality of a given state statute, notwithstanding the potential en banc consideration to follow or potentially an appeal to the Supreme Court. In any event, I want to say this critically important emergency hearing. Our hearts are broken for the children of Uvalde, Texas. They are broken for the people of Buffalo, New York, and they are broken for the countless Americans murdered each and every day in our country. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, the level of gun violence in our country is not normal, and we cannot stand for it. It is time, long past time, to act and to start saving lives. My home state of Colorado has experienced the pain and the tragedy of gun violence far too often. In 1999, I was 14 years old. School was put on lockdown because 10 miles away, 2 shooters had entered Columbine High School and murdered in cold blood 13 innocent teachers and students. From Columbine, Aurora, to the STEM school in Highlands Ranch, and as was mentioned previously, to a grocery store in my community last year, where 10 innocent people were murdered in Boulder, Colorado. Countless lives lost, children, parents, Coloradans, and Americans. The high schoolers who experienced Columbine, and yet 23 years later, our kids continue to face gunfire in the places where they are supposed to be safe. Columbine was once considered to be the deadliest shoot history at the time. And that, as we all know, is no longer the case. From Sandy Hook to Uvalde. As policymakers, we have the opportunity today to do our part in stopping this act. And today we are doing precisely. Protecting Our Kids Act makes common sense changes to our gun laws that'll save lives. The safe storage requirements, which we passed in Colorado last year, raising the age required to buy semi-automatic rifles, another common sense measure that I've co-sponsored since I came to Congress. There is more that we can and we must do. And I will certainly keep pushing for the same every day because Boulder any longer, Colorado can't wait any longer, and our country certainly can't wait any longer. So I thank the chairman again for bringing this bill up for markup today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purposes Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. I reserve a point of order. Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7910, offered by Mr.
Chairman, I move that the amendment be considered as read.
That motion. The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there's in which I believe that we could work together to find some bipartisan solutions to this crisis, and this amendment is one of those possibilities. Following the shooting in Park, former Sheriff Congressman John Rutherford led a bipartisan group of members, including myself, in reauthorizing spending the ops through our program. Mr. Chairman, I think somebody is unmuted out there that should mute.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That program provides necessary funds to states and local school districts to strengthen security measures at schools across. The money can be used for metal detectors, for example. It can be used. It can be used to adopt security plans. It can be used to find students who have mental health issues and get those students the treatments that they need, among other things. And oftentimes, those students who may ultimately become dangerous with or without a weapon, or these particular incidents ought to be handled. The first can be locked and kept locked, and a whole range of other ways to make our schools safer. One of the additional items the grants could be used for is hiring school resource our schools. In particular, I think that we should be looking to hire retired police officers. And following Parkland, I met with the head of OP here in Cincinnati, and that was his suggestion. And that was the reason that I had initially offered this and why I've been pushing for this since that time. And we'd like to see that expand just retired police officers, but also honorably discharged military personnel. And they could also serve as resource officers where needed. At least a handful of school districts in my district in the greater Cincinnati area that either cannot find any school resource officers or cannot as they'd like to hire because of lack of available personnel that have the necessary training. Obviously, I won't name those districts or those schools and expose any potential security abilities, but I'm sure that if this problem exists in Cincinnati, it exists in other parts of the country as well. Fortunately, we have a fairly expansive group of highly trained available, and that's our retired police officers and honorably discharged military personnel. Placing highly trained and professional individuals in our schools is one of the easiest and safest school security. And no one is better trained and better equipped to handle potential school shootings than those folks, the police officers and military personnel. My amendment expressed that more states and local school districts should consider employing retired officers and military personnel where it's appropriate as school resource officers. Hiring retired military personnel to provide school security is a common sense step to better secure our schools, and it could be achieved almost immediately. Doing so could go a long way towards protecting our students who are in school to learn, not to become victims. Mr. Chairman, our nation's schools have become soft targets for who has gotten access to a gun. We even advertise with a sign that the murderer-to-be will be the only person on the scene with a gun. It's almost like a better job of protecting both students and teachers, and unfortunately, increasingly frequent threats, all vulnerable, and unfortunately, increasingly frequent threats. Adopting this common sense amendment would be a significant step, I believe, in the, and it's something we could do right now. And I think this is something that really would make a difference because hopefully we will be, if this passes and is part of the bill, members can reach out to school districts and schools in their own communities and make them aware that this money is available for them to harden the schools. That would actually.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on a point of order?
I withdraw my point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. It is based on the belief that the way to protect students is to have a good guy with a gun, as the Republicans often say, to stop the bad guy with a gun. I believe that phrase was coined by the multi-million-dollar gun lobby's dealer, Wayne LaPierre, after a shooter killed 20 little children in Newtown, Connecticut. For the past 10 years, we've seen time and again that concept has been a catchy saying designed to hide the truth, that Republicans refuse to help protect Americans from people we all agree should not be allowed to possess a weapon, as we're hearing today. In Uvalde, there were 7 good. They didn't feel they could go stop that bad guy. The gunman in Buffalo killed a good guy with a gun. We've tested that theory, and there's 31 dead people in these 2 attacks alone. Test. Texas is filled with good guys with guns. Texas laws are so pro-gun lobby that companies need to swear they won't discriminate against the firearm industry. In Texas, there are over 800 federally regulated licensed firearm dealers, and according to RAND, 37% of Texan adults lived in a household with a firearm between 2007 and 2016. Again, Texas with good guys with guns. But that couldn't save the lives of those 19 children and 2 teachers. It's time to try something new. Republicans are the same people who told us that more good guys with guns. Then they told us that armed officers in schools would keep kids safe. Then they told us more shooter drills would solve the problem. Then they told us again that armed officers in schools would solve the problem. Proven wrong. Children have been murdered. How many children have to die before we stop taking it seriously? This amendment goes in the wrong direction, and I therefore... No one... For what purpose does Mr. Swallow... No one... For what purpose does Mr. Swallow seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I understand this that Mr. Shabbat is bringing to this. I'm the son of a person. Our law enforcement family is just horrified by what happened at Uvalde. Its family is just horrified by what happened at Uvalde. It's also unconscionable that police officers waited outside of a classroom, were being slaughtered, and 911 calls were being made from inside that classroom. We have come to see across America is that classroom pleading for their lives. But see across America is that our law enforcement are just outgunned. We're a country of unrestricted weaponry that continues to put the most dangerous weapons in the hands of people. So we could hire 100,000 retired police officers, but if we are a country that has over 100 million assault rifles, that's what we saw in Uvalde. And tragically, in 2016, in Dallas, Texas, 5 brave police officers, SWAT-trained police, were murdered by a killer with an assault rifle. So I think we've debunked the idea that the answer to a killer with an assault rifle is to have, quote, good guys with guns. The good guys with guns are outgunned by the bad guys that we've given guns in our country. And so that's why we're addressing the root of the problem, 6 pieces of legislation. And with that, I'm going to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island, Mr. Sicily.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd just like to add a couple of thoughts. First is, I don't think there is a single incident, and maybe there's one, but I've not found one, of an assailant using an assault weapon that was stopped by a, so this is maybe there's one of the thousands and thousands and thousands of shootings, but the truth of the matter is school resource officers are an important response. I was a mayor of a city, we hired school resource officers. But what I also know is it requires special training to be a school resource officer, and it's up to local communities to decide where that's appropriate, what schools they want to use school resource officers. And so having someone who's a retired police officer or someone who used to be in the Army may not actually be the best person to be in that position. And in addition to that, I think the cops requires the hiring of police officers. And so I think we're urging the sense of Congress is actually to violate the requirements of the COPS program. So I don't think internally the amendment can specifically for police officers. I think there are good reasons that it be current police officers who are current training, who really understand what a school resource officer does. It's not about just plunking down a law enforcement person, creates the impression that that's the source of gun violence in schools. It's not. So I strongly support.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman...
Well, the Democrats, I don't know if they're just in will or they're being deceptive today, but I would like to insert a list of cases where concealed handgun permit holders have likely stopped mass public shootings. This is from crimeresearch.org. It was published May 27th, 2022.
Without objection.
I'll read from this list, and I'm going to run out of time, but I'll try to make each of these summaries brief because there are dozens of instances. Even report them. Sometimes they get reported. Just this week, last week, May 25th, 2022, Charleston, West Virginia. Here, a man with an extensive criminal history started firing a firearm into a crowd. Fortunately, a woman who was legally carrying a gun was there to stop the attack. She shot the attacker. It ended before anybody got hurt. South Fulton, Georgia, 2022. A teenager started firing his gun at multiple people. There was a large number of people present at the park because of an anti-violence riot. South Fulton, Georgia. This comes from a news said, the men involved in the shootout with handbrake have been cooperative and will likely not be charged since the teenager fired the first shot. After having reviewed most of the witnesses' statements, it appears that Mr. Hambrick discharged his weapon first, and as a result of that, there was an exchange of gunfire between him and two individuals, good guys with the gun. Portland, Oregon, February 19th, 2022. Confronted participants at a racial justice demonstration Saturday night before pulling out a handgun and shooting multiple people in the crowd, leaving one woman dead and several others injured. The shooting when a person with the group of demonstrators who is licensed to conceal carry a firearm fired back, striking the homeowner in the hip. Again, a good guy with a gun stops the shooter. Pennsylvania, October 17th, 2021. On Sunday, October 17th, 4 people were injured after a fight between 2 teenagers at Lancaster Park. City Center Mall escalated into a shooting. This 10-year-old who was illegally carrying a gun started the shooting, but it could have been much worse were it not for concealed handgun permit holder. A bystander armed with a gun in the shooting one of the participants, the unidentified bystander who legally possessed the firearm, had heard gunshots related to the fight between 2 males that knew each other, police said. The bystander security and police arrived. Syracuse, New York, August 30, 2021. The district attorney credited a property manager with legally possessed 9mm handgun, the very gun that Joe Biden wants to ban, and fatally wounded him outside a building. San Antonio, Texas, August 11, a woman who crashed in San Antonio's West Side neighborhood climbed out of her vehicle and began shooting indiscriminately at people to death, ending the violent threat to the neighborhood. And that was a good guy with a gun, or good gal with a gun sometimes. And fired multiple shots into a crowd before a bystander returned fire. A man who was a convicted felon and fired multiple shots into a crowd before a bystander returned fire. When the bystander confronted the attacker, he stopped attacking and threw his gun in a parking lot. Fortunately, no one was injured in the Chicago, Illinois, July 4th, 2021. It seems likely that if the concealed handgun permit holder hadn't intervened in this case, there would have been at least 3 deaths instead of just the one woman. Colorado, June 21st, 2021, the attacker and 2 other people were killed in this attack. A good Samaritan who was killed in a shooting in Alvarado, Colorado. He did not hesitate. He didn't stand there and think about it. Gunfire, went to the door, saw the shooter, and immediately ran in that direction. I just want to make sure his family knows how heroic he was. Toronto said he witnessed Hurley confront the gunman. Mr. Hurley shot him. I heard 6 shots from his gun, maybe 5. Police chief said Hurley is a true hero who likely disrupted what could have been a larger loss of life. I'm running out of time, but Fort Smith, Arkansas, Maven Zachary Arnold, 26, fatally shot Lois Hicks, 87, in her apartment, then began shooting at other people in neighborhood apartments. Wallace A. West, 58, used a rifle, not a concealed handgun, to stop the Metairie, Louisiana, February 20th, 2021, having murdered 2 people and wounded a couple of others. It's clear that the attacker intended to kill as many people as possible. The quick gun permit stopped the attack. I could go on forever. I'm submitting this document. Hopefully my colleagues who sit here and keep saying that a good guy with a gun never stops a bad guy with a gun will read this deal back.
Gentleman yields back for purposes. Gentlelady from Texas, seek recognition.
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I always look forward to working with the gentleman from Ohio. I recognize the intent behind this legislation. I would offer to him that the very of his amendment is already covered. There's already opportunity to do that. Who they bring into their school. I think it's worthy to take note of the fact that the Robb Elementary, the gun that was nowhere to be found. Tragic. I think it's worthy to understand that good guys with guns can wind up killing, like a little girl, and some good guy who was robbed way out of the way began to chase her vehicle, driven by her dad, and shot at it. She is dead. So no matter how we try to circumvent, to protect our kids with guns that can already be handled by school districts and other entities, clearly is not the answer. Why are we running from the crux of the matter? Why are we running away from 19 dead children and 2 beloved teachers and her husband who just died of a broken heart? Why are we running away from Buffalo, white supremacists, hatefulness, and a good guy with a gun, which has been mentioned? But there was and an automatic weapon. Why are we running away from this style weapon as being unnecessary on the streets of America? Why are we running away from bumps that helped kill 59 in Las Vegas? Why are we running away? Or am I to not be concerned about my officers' HPD ghost gun that shot my police officers in Houston? Why are we running away from this? I appreciate the gentleman's effort. You'll hear me again. The police have told you what you're doing is correct. Major chiefs, ban bump stock, reinstate the assault weapons ban, ban high-capacity magazines. Everything to do. My good friend in Ohio said, I said, we're not finished. You're absolutely right. We're planting the seeds, not hysteria, planting the seeds. I'm standing on good ground. Scalia in the Heller case. Why? Because he indicates there's no unlimited use of guns. He clearly said, or the opinion, along with find support in the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. These are dangerous and unusual. Someone asked, are you against all assault weapons? Well, there's a long list in the assault weapons legislation that we're thinking about that are exempted. So that's why I argue for a 7-day waiting period on automatic weapons. But it's good. They're going to be looking at schools. There is a long document that I will hold up about school security that we've already put forward on the federal level. Of plans. But a good guy with a gun was missing in action at the elementary school as the parents are crying and saying she was blocked from going in to get her children. She went around the school and broke in. We'll get more facts about that, but the issue is there are tools. Why are we sidestepping the crux of our problem? The fact that guns are not stored, the fact that there are ammunition, that the facts that we have trafficking, that the age is ludicrous, and that's why the parents have asked me over and over, 18-year-old getting a gun. And the grandmother who saw this child get it, his gun was not stored or locked up. Maybe he bought it, but maybe the parents should have had the key. They did not, or maybe when he bought it, there should have been some devices for storing. So again, I'm not going to say anything about Mr. Shabbat's amendment other than it can already be done. Crux of what we're doing today, Mr. Cabot sent out a message for them to utilize existing law. But you are moving away from what we're dealing with. The killing guns and munition needing to pass the Protect Kids Act. We need to pass it now. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose is Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I would yield to.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The good guys with the guns here that we're talking about are retired police officers, highly trained people with weapons that a community can possibly have. These are people that we've trusted to keep generally for 25 years or so. These men and women retire oftentimes in their early 50s or so, and they're able to work years. It just seems to make sense that places that I think we all agree we need to protect, that's schools and students and the teachers, that you have the best, most highly trained people of all to protect them. And that's have the best, most highly trained people of all to protect them. And that's the police officers. Now, we've expanded it to also and former military personnel who are honorably discharged. Now, you know, you can have people involved in the military that have problems as well and left under unhonorable circumstances. We're talking about folks, both our police officers and our military personnel, folks, both our police officers and our military expertise for a decade, or even that our tax dollars have paid for to train to have this expertise. What expertise for a decade or even 2 decades to protect the most important resources that we have in this country, and that's our children. I'm a former school teacher in 8th grade in an inner city school. It's been quite a few years ago, and we were fortunate that we didn't have one of these types of incidences occur while I was a teacher there. That happened, but unfortunately, far too many do. And what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have proposed today are a number of items. Many of them will ultimately be declared almost identical cases have already been declared to be unconstitutional, yet that's what they're pushing ahead here. I'm simply suggesting that we make it more that we let people that could actually get these folks to protect our children within their schools, give them more information about it, make it more known to them, available, and that these resources are there. There's other things, of course, that we can do to protect children in those schools too. It's not just police officers, but there are other parts of it. And again, I want to compliment John Rutherford, a former sheriff, one of our colleagues from Florida, who had a lot of experience in this area as former law enforcement, for pushing not just the police officers, but also metal detectors as an option, more training for the teachers by those troubled students who might ultimately somewhere down the road participate in some sort of incident like this where they target fellows or younger students or anybody for that matter. So, I mean, that makes sense. It also makes sense to train our teachers and our administrative personnel. When you have a circumstance like this that's happening, what's the best way that you can do to save lives? So all of those things are important. Those are things that we can and are doing a lot more. And I would suggest, my colleagues, rather than opposing this, which I think is a very common sense thing, which would actually make a difference, stop this and make at least something good in this bill. And I'm willing to discuss some of the other things that my Democratic colleagues have proposed here. But overall, I don't think it's helpful. I think it focuses on, well, we've done something, but unfortunately, I don't think it's going to make anybody any safer, especially since a lot of it's going to be probably being unconstitutional in any event. We know this is constitutional. We know that tax dollars are already going to this. Let's let schools be more aware.
We lost his audio, and we're waiting for it to be restored, and we've stopped the clock. Mr. Shedd, now you can be heard. Okay, proceed.
Okay, common sense amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Ms. Escobar.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to...
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to say that my heart goes out to Buffalo, Uvalde, Tulsa, and the innumerable communities like my own, communities that have suffered the carnage and trauma of gun violence. I've been listening to my Republican colleagues on this committee for the last 2 hours as they desperately try to rationalize and their unwillingness to support our legislation. I'd like to speak directly. Republicans are trying to convince you that anyone who wants a gun should have unfettered access to one. Whether you want to take a weapon of war into a state that outlaws them, armed with a ghost gun, or whether you're an 18-year-old who wants an assault-style weapon, but who isn't even old enough to drink. You're hearing it over and that the only way to solve our gun crisis is by flooding our neighborhoods with more guns. If you want a glimpse at the kind of dark vision they have for America, just look at my state of Texas, example of what they want. In Texas, after the slaughter in El Paso, the governor, Greg Abbott, promised to change our laws. And he did. He loosened them to the dark vision today's Republican Party has for America. In Texas, the age for access to certain guns was lowered from 21 to 18. You can now open carry. In Texas, you don't need training. In Texas, you don't need a license. Many school districts have their own police force already, including the school district in Uvalde. Once again, proving that a good guy with a gun mostly doesn't stop a bad guy, especially when that bad guy has high capacity magazines and an assault style weapon. The guns my Republican colleagues want in our neighborhoods don't just pierce, they destroy, shatter bones, shatter nerves. Their vision of America is one where describe the Wild West shootouts happening across America as though he's perversely proud of this, ardent. And then we condition they want is to ensure every ardent. And then we continue on this spiral of violence that is as unique to America as these deadly gun laws are. Not more mass shootings in Texas, but his approach has hastened them. And my Republican colleagues will continue to on and on. But what's the common denominator in gun violence attacks? It's the guns. Democrats aren't asking for anything unreasonable. And in fact, we're following the American public. I'm following the lead of the majority of my constituents, as well as the victims of gun violence after the August 3rd, 2019 shooting in El Paso. People over and over again, they want us to do our job. Americans are tired of their children dying. Americans are tired of being afraid to go into grocery stores, outdoor concerts. To my Republican colleagues, look at Texas, a state that has tried it your way. There's blood everywhere. To the American people, extremism that has gripped the Republican Party. They're addicted to it. They're slaves to it. They post ghoulish photos of themselves with weapons of war and use it as their Christmas. They photograph their children with those weapons. They participate in congressional hearings virtually adorned with them. As they continue with their destructive behavior, it's up to serious public. Do our job, make people safe. I'd love for Republicans to join us, but when they do not, the American public must take heed of protects them, protects law enforcement, and protects their children, and which party chooses its ghoulish obsession over all else. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
General Leader yields back. For what purposes Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Ms. Jackson Lee, who reminded us that the crux of today's hearing is to protect children at schools. And I think that is really important. Mr. Shabbat's amendment is so important. And the reason I support it is because it does get at the crux of why we are here today, whereas the 6 bills that are rolled into the day doesn't get at that. It just doesn't, it simply doesn't get at that. When you add retired police officers and honorably discharged retired to the folks that can come in and help defend schools, you are actually, Anna previously recited today, the manifesto written by the shooter from Buffalo said that he was effectively looking for gun zones. What a school police officer presence would do would provide deterrence. And really, that is the crux of what we're talking about here today. How criminally violent people from going in and committing mass shootings and mass murders. So it seems to me perfectly rational, the Shabbat Amendment. Now, I will add to some of the times that people do stop. People with guns do stop bad, criminally evil people from committing heinous crime about 1.5 million times a year. people with guns stop violent, heinous acts. In other words, they deter and save violence and save lives. That's what Mr. Shabat's amendment gets to. I think of a guy named Stephen Williford. He was the guy who stopped the mass shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas. I had a chance to visit with him with several other members of Congress. He said his biggest regret was that he had to get his weapon out of his gun safe to go over and engage the demonic gunman at Sutherland Springs. That had he been able to get over there even 30 seconds sooner, he would have saved 4 or 5 lives. That's important to put these things in context. The reality is, we know that people with guns and their presence deters bad actors. Does it deter all bad actors? No, but it does deter bad actors. Angry, malevolent, people with murderous intent. That's why Mr. Shabat's amendment is so important. It ends the pool of people who are qualified to come in and help defend our schools. So if the crux of this is really to deter people who will shoot up schools, and I believe that's what we're talking about here today. Then this amendment is wholesale and whole on and should be adopted. But if this hearing is something different, the way the gentleman from New York was talking about, and actually several others have talked about, is it's really to ultimately lay the predicate for Second Amendment and taking away guns, whether they be an AR-15 or whether they be a 9mm handgun. Well, then that's an entirely different matter in a completely different hearing. But if you're talking about deterrence, then Mr. Shabat's amendment should be adopted, and that's why I support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson of Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here for the children, for the kids. We're talking about protecting our kids from out of control gun violence. You know, it was almost 10 years ago, December the 14th of 2012, when Sandy Hook took place. A 20-year-old with an assault weapon murdered 20 children between the ages of 5 and 6 and killed 6 teachers. And at that time, the head of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, uttered words that Republicans continue to mock, is that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. It hasn't worked in the schools since. I watched last week, the nation watched a press conference, Governor Abbott of Texas recounting what allegedly occurred at the school where 19 more children murdered by a guy with an 18-year-old. And Governor Abbott was interrupted by my former colleague, Beto O'Rourke, at what he was hearing. You see, the governor was not telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He talked about, the governor, that there was a school good guy with a gun who tried to stop the bad guy with the gun. But that turned out not to be true. It was actually a night good guy with a gun who tried to stop the bad guy with the gun. But that turned out cowboy hats with guns, and they weren't able to stop. They weren't able to stop that 18-year-old with a more powerful weapon. Today, we're talking about reining in this out-of-control gun violence, which prevents our children from being able to feel secure as they go to school. 10 years, we've had a series of events in this nation where there have been good guys with guns who weren't able to. 2 weeks ago in Buffalo, New York, 10 people murdered, including an armed security guard and former police officer who shot at but the gunman had a bigger gun than he had. And this brave former police officer put his life on the line, and we thank him for that. Lost his life trying to protect others. Bad guy with a gun, 1. Good guy with a gun, 0. In 2017, police and security guards, both at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival in Las Vegas and in the hotel where the shooter was perched and carried out that mass murder, and over 800 injured. Bad guy with a gun, 2. Good guy with a gun, 0. In 2016, in Orlando, a security guard shot at the gunman before the gunman went into the club, ultimately killing 49 people. Bad guy with a gun, 3, 0. In 2018, a shooter killed 10 people at Santa Fe High School in Texas. 2 officers who were on site, and 1 was wounded. Bad guy with a gun, 4. Good guy with a gun, 0. We've listened to my colleagues on the other side recount situations where individuals armed with handguns, protecting themselves and the lives of others, were successful. I can't argue with that other than to point out that they didn't do it with assault weapons. There were 18, a school resource officer was on the campus at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He couldn't stop killing 17 high schoolers. Bad guy with a gun, 5. Good guy with a gun, 0. When will we stop relying on the notion that the only thing that stops bad guys is good guys? Congress can stop some bad guys with some good legislation, and that's what we're here to do today. And with that,
Gentleman yields back for purposes of Mr. Roy seek recognition.
Want to ask to speak on the amendment?
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have more to say on the underlying measure in a little bit. I just wanted to make a couple of comments just because it did or did not occur in Uvalde. The district I represent does not contain Uvalde. It borders. I know a lot of the people in the community in Uvalde, and including some of the folks involved. I got a phone call last Tuesday because I had been trading messages with the mayor of Uvalde, and then we missed each other, and so then happening. And the mayor texted me, and pulling it up here, and he said, well, before we knew anything, the reports weren't out. He said, the reports it looks like 18 to 20 young kids, quote, assholes shot them and stacked them like firewood. We've all been reeling since then, knowing what that meant to a community at Clothing. And it's horrific, and it's the face of evil. I don't know whether or not a resolution or a sense of by my friend from Ohio will make a significant difference. But I do know I appreciate what the gentleman is trying to focus on, which is how do we bad actors from carrying out bad acts, and then what do we do in that, and how do we respond to it? There's a lot of commentary going on about what police didn't do in the school in Uvalde. And I would just ask for members to respect the process of looking through before we pass judgment. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, made the point that there are still a lot of investigations underway, state, federal, and local. I've gotten multiple different accounts, federal and local. I've gotten multiple different accounts, even in the last 2 days, We saw yesterday, for example, the day before, the open door by the teacher turned out not to be exactly accurate. The door had been propped open, a relation protocol, no doubt. But then when she heard gunfire, allegedly went in and knocked the prop out. In fact, my point is, the entire country was there. Right? Well, that's a fact that I don't even know. Fact. My point is, the entire country was then saying, well, what's wrong with this teacher who propped this door? And then that caused, well, then imagine, and I happen to know some facts about this, when everybody's out across America saying how, blaming her. And then now focus on the police and blaming, 19 cops or 7 cops or 3 cops. I get vote from every person talking about it, standing in the hallway like they're sitting around their thumb up their rear while bad things are happening. Well, that's not true fully based on what I count. I'm not here to defend the officers on the scene. I'm not here to criticize the officers on the scene. I'm here to say that let's wait on the damn facts, because these are people and we ought to be making sober judgment and making policy accordingly. Because what if the hardening and the steel doors were actually part of the difficulty of entering? What if there wasn't appropriate timing and training for getting the key? I don't know. There are a lot of facts that I'm still waiting to reserve judgment on. I would just ask that our colleagues, both sides of the aisle, but I've heard it from my Democratic colleagues today, making judgments about cops standing there. And I don't believe that was true for the vast majority who are trying to get access to and try to protect those kids. And they don't deserve to be lumped into one group. We can make determinations about who made what decisions when there were pass judgment accordingly. But we're still getting reports and facts on that. I feel really strongly about that. And I believe that no matter where this occurs in the country, get the facts and then figure out policy. Things that have been raised about AR-15s. And I don't know how much time I have left because I don't have a clock in front of me, and I apologize for not being in person. I couldn't get a flight to work morning as I intended. And I have more to say about it, but a lot is being said about the AR-15, about being a weapon of war and what all it can do, going through concrete, going through cinder blocks and ripping people apart, and that it is a weapon of war. But the fact of the matter is, it's more accurate to say that a Remington 700 bolt action rifle or 30-aught, the AR-15, which is not. Now, it's obviously a cousin to some degree, but it is a semi-automatic weapon. And I've heard reference to automatic weapons. The gentlelady from Texas referred to automatic weapon without a permit. It is a semi-automatic weapon. And I've heard a lot of people here saying, well, why can't you get on board with this legislation? Because, it's just limiting a magazine.
Gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike. I am just so really frustrated that our colleagues on the other side, with their responses to the slaughter, to provide more people with guns, rather in our schools, and there are people with guns, rather than taking guns out of the hands of people who absolutely should not have access to them. And as we know, there were 19 officers outside of the Robb Elementary where a gunman executed child after child after child, one for each child that was taken away from us. This false notion of good guys with guns does not work. That has been disproved over and over and over again. In Buffalo, New York, a security guard with a gun, a retired police officer, in fact, heroically tried to defend the shop store. But he was shot down by the gunman with an assault weapon. Turning our schools into fortresses is absolutely not the answer. We cannot ignore our duty to protect our children from being massacred. Yes, improving school safety, but sensible gun safety is the fastest way to keep our families safe. Trust me, I am a survivor of gun violence. I am a survivor, a mother of senseless gun violence. We are teetering here in America on the brink of being one of violent nations in the world. If we want to invest in our schools, invest in the mental health of the children, and care each and every single day that they're in school, they're going to be the next site of a mass shooting. It is imperative that we focus on ensuring that in the wrong hands so that we are operating on the offense in preventing these shootings from happening in the first place, rather than acting in defense, offering thoughts and prayers once they occur. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Seek recognition.
Speaking on behalf of the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
Wait a
Chairman.
minute,
I first want to thank the gentleman from Ohio for bringing the amendment. And obviously my Democrat colleagues make not every time a good guy has a gun does he stop a bad guy with a gun. But it does happen on occasion. Not every time that someone locks up a gun in a home in a nearby school from entering and firing a gun. None of these measures that the Democrats have proposed today stop all violence. Mr. Shabbat's help, it's not intended to, and nobody suggests that it does, eliminate all chances of violence. But I want to respond to the gentlelady from Texas when the dark vision that Republicans have. I think a lot of people in this country are offended that the lady would go that direction. She said that anyone who wants to own a gun, Republicans believe anyone who wants to own a gun should be able to get one. I don't believe that. I don't think most of my Republican colleagues, if any, believe that. I think convicted of a dangerous felony, a violent felony, should not have a gun. I think it's quite obvious that there are people in this country that have forfeited their right to guns, as it's not absolute, and we should take that. The gentlelady talked about a dark vision that Republicans have for America, that somehow a good guy with a gun is not able, is not enough to stop a bad guy with a gun. Well, the Democrats have taken away the ability of a good guy to have a gun in a school to bad guys. A teacher who wants to bring a gun to school, an administrator, a coach, others can't do that right now. But I also think that, if you want to point out dark visions for America, when the Democrats argue for an open border, what they're arguing for is to allow dangerous gang members to come across that border, MS-13 and others, and they have. The border up, they allow dangerous drugs to come across the border, like fentanyl. Leading cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds in this country is drug overdose. That is a direct relation that occurs because of the open border policies of this administration, particularly Secretary Mayorkas. When you open a border, you allow terrorists to come across the border. When you open a border, Mr. Cohen, who mentioned earlier about the gun parts that are coming in from China that allow a semi-automatic weapon to be converted into an automatic weapon. That happens by opening a border. And the Democrats talk about that as a solution to close our border and to get a grip on the terrible things that have been happening as a result of that. The Democrats promoted a culture of death in this country with their views on abortion. We have late-term abortions, absolutely horrific late-term abortions that somehow the Democrats think, can happen in a vacuum and that it won't have an impact. We have people being paid not to work. Oftentimes, those people are also using drugs, getting money from the government to buy the drug. Gas prices skyrocketing in this country. Are those the dark vision of the Democrat Party? I don't think so. I think they're bad policies that have been made by the liberal progressives in the Democrat Party. But I have a dark vision of the Democrats. And I think what we have to do is make sure we get away from the kind of language that the gentlelady, what's happening in our schools, or we get away from the kind of language that the gentlelady from Texas used to accuse Republicans of having some kind of dark vision. We care deeply about what's happening in our schools. We disagree that these shallow, inconsequential Congress are asking for. Let's have some meaningful discussion on how to get to the bottom line, how to address not the gun, but the person behind the gun, how to address the that we see in our society that will allow us to get to the point where we are a safer country. And I thank the gentleman from Ohio for offering one small piece of it, and really disappointing that the Democrats won't acknowledge that it is a small piece, but it is a positive.
Gentleman from Rhode Island, seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I first want to say, in response to the gentleman from Texas's comment about why don't we just wait? We understand all the facts of Uvalde with some more investigation underway. He acted as if we've had 2 shootings in America, 2 mass shootings, and we are responding to thousands and thousands and thousands of shootings in this country over the last decade. And so what have been developed here in response to a gun violence epidemic. And the idea,
will the gentleman yield for 10
I will
seconds?
not yield. The idea that we should wait while we can have families that have lost, expecting Congress to respond.
Time belongs
and the
to the gentleman
idea as
from Rhode
to
Island.
respond to the cries of people all across this
Island.
country who have asked and demanded that Congress act. So no, we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't wait another second. We shouldn't wait another minute. We should act now. The second thing is, my friend and colleague from Colorado, just shallow and inconsequential. I'm going to go through just a few pieces of this. Ghost guns were used in a shooting in Santa Clara, California, that killed 3 people. Ghost guns were used in November of 2000, we all know in Las Vegas, that killed 60. Were killed. 22 were killed in Uvalde. Santa Fe High School, 10 were killed. 13 were injured. Parkland, Florida, 17 injured. Newtown, Sandy Hook Elementary School, 27 children were killed. 15 people were killed and 24 were injured. Individuals would not have been able to buy the gun they bought if the bill that we're going to pass today were the law. Safe storage, the list goes on for pages. So to say inconsequential when it would have saved many, many people, and as Chairman Nadler said, even if it's 1 life. So to say it's inconsequential and then avoid responsibility to act in the face of gun violence in this country. Shame on those who we have lost to gun violence. I'm taking this issue seriously and being committed to finding solutions. Do you think a grieving mother or father who's watching you wants to hear you talk about abortion and we're trying to respond to gun violence that led to the death of their child? That's what this hearing's about. These families, and sadly there are, who have suffered unspeakable pain because Congress has failed to act, and our Republican colleagues in this and reducing gun violence in this country. We owe it to their memory. We owe it to the oath that we have taken to protect our constituents, our most. And people talk about the Second Amendment. We've heard it again today. It's a constitutional amendment. You can't touch it. That is not true. The Supreme Court of the United States.
Gentleman, you.
The Supreme Court of the United States has made it clear that Congress has the authority and the security of those we serve. In the same way, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There is no constitutional right that is absolute. It is balanced with responsibility.
Would the gentleman yield?
And so all these, we wish we could do something. We wish we could remove America from this terrible distinction of being more guns were the answer. We live in the safest country in the world. There are more guns in America than people. Our country is awash in guns, and it has produced gun violence. So that's not the answer. We've tried it. It doesn't work. We need real solutions so we can go back to our districts and demonstrate to the people we serve we've taken some action that's going to make lives in communities all across this country. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, for what purposes? Gentleman from Florida, seek recognition.
Strike the last word. Said about is the number of guns in the country. This isn't about, modest age restrictions that are unconstitutional. It's not about better record keeping. They want guns. They think fewer guns. And that is what is creating a lot of discomfort among our fellow Americans.
Their children, Mr. Gates?
You know what? Their children aren't the ones at risk as a consequence. Okay?
Were those children in Uvalde?
Here's the tension, okay? You guys are spasming into this reflexive response, and you happen in Uvalde. And we all agree it was awful and tragic, but you are not providing the thoughtful solutions that would actually reduce the likelihood of that. When you make an argument in the Judiciary Committee for a change in the law, you have to demonstrate a need for the change, and that what you're bringing forward will actually affect that in a positive way. And it's the second part of the argument where the bills you've presented today undeniable. And in Florida, I would suggest we had a process that's a little bit better than what we've observed here. In Florida, occur again for precisely the reasons that animate your passions today. But instead of rushing to town, stumbling bills together, we got our very best sheriffs, our very best police chief, law enforcement, people with tactical experience, even parents of slain children. And we put them on a board to review a school shooting as if it were an airline crash, dispassionately, thoroughly. The consequence, what we saw was actually a failure in law enforcement, that the sheriff in Broward County was so recalcitrant in not doing the training, that the on-the-ground law enforcement were derelict in their duties, that children died that didn't need to. And so Governor DeSantis rightly fired that sheriff, replaced them, put better training in, more money to harden our schools and our houses of worship across the state of Florida, and we're safer as a consequence. So it's not that we're particularly here to talk about abortion or the border. We understand we have to make these things less likely, but whether emergency hearing to respond to a leaked draft opinion, you holding an emergency hearing to respond to a leaked draft opinion that's not even final, or now when the Congressman Roy from Texas says, gosh, before you have the emergency, figure out what happened in Uvalde so that we can make that frequency less likely to occur. I think there's also a balancing of interests here. It's one life. If it's anything that saves one life is totally worth doing. And certainly every loss of life is tragic, and certainly every preventable loss of life is tragic. But Mr. when he said, we acknowledge on the front end of this hearing that there will be deprivations of liberty to law-abiding people, that we will at times stop law-abiding people from doing what is otherwise constitutionally legal. So while I certainly want every American to safely store their firearms, while I certainly want every American to be trained on the safe storage of firearms, I'm not entirely sure that the United States is the appropriate entity to tell Americans how to store firearms and then punish them as a consequence. And if the result of all of this is there's a a life, and the result is, like, how many tens of millions of Americans are you willing to deprive of their constitutionally guaranteed liberty in order to achieve that objective, when there might be a more restrained, appropriate way for gun enthusiast groups, hunting clubs, local government, states, to try to educate of the storage of firearms. So again, we share your goal of making these shootings less likely, whether they be in our life, that fundamentally constraining the rights of all Americans is necessary, especially when we are still awaiting the results of the review of what happened in Uvalde that shocks the conscience. Please spare us the spirited screaming. We want to stop the violence. We just wish you would listen to some of the ideas that we think would help. And from my standpoint, if you hold drones as soft targets, you make those school shootings more likely. And I don't think you want to do that, but I think that if we got out of the gun-free zones and if we empowered people that could be helpful, we might see a reduction. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? The gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Move to strike, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
The gentleman from Florida said that he and his Republican colleagues in this country, but it's difficult to believe that when there are common sense steps that Congress can take and they are unanimously obstructing those approaches. I want to elaborate what Cicilline said earlier today, because it is clear to me that the more they are giving up the fact that they've not actually read those documents. Let's start with the Second Amendment. The text is clear. The amendment protects the collective right of the people, arms solely for the purpose of forming a well-regulated militia. Now, last time I checked, capacity magazines. Notice that while the Second Amendment is explicit that the government has the authority to regulate the use of arms, the Second Amendment does not include not one word about an individual right to own a gun. In fact, the claim that the Second Amendment protects an individual, even the conservative former Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, no less, had once denounced it as, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public he had ever heard, The Supreme Court never recognized an individual right to own a gun from the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 until 2008, when the Roberts Courts already issued its 5-4 opinion in Heller. So let's talk about Heller. Yes, Heller did set a constitutional baseline that there is a right to own a handgun for self-defense in the home. In that egregiously mistaken decision, even in that decision, the court made clear that we can still regulate gun ownership and possession, particularly in sensitive places, as well as prohibit an individual firearms. As the late Justice Scalia's opinion explains, quote, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. And, quote, the right was and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. In fact, Justice Scalia went out of his way to emphasize that the would be plainly constitutional. He wrote, quote, nothing in our opinion, nothing should be taken to cast doubt on laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. And he continued that, quote, another important limitation on the right to keep and carry arms is that only, quote, the sorts of weapons protected were those in common use at the time. The Constitution does not condemn us to allow weapons of war to flood our neighborhood. My colleague's desperate citation to an outlier ruling by two Trumpality of what the Supreme Court has said. That is why even more circuits have upheld age restrictions on firearm purchases. The Fifth Circuit has twice upheld restrictions on particular weapons for 18. The Supreme Court declined to weigh in both of those times, allowing the Fifth Circuit to be the final word in upholding these age restrictions. And the First and Seventh Circuits have upheld age restrictions as activist, Trump-appointed judges may be trying to change settled law, just as they are trying to roll back decades of settled law upholding the right to an abortion. Don't believe the lie that they are selling, a lie so radical that even the far-right Roberts Court hasn't endorsed it. Age restrictions are nothing new. So I've heard enough, and I think I speak for my Democratic colleagues when I say this, of ill-informed, bad faith constitution to protecting our kids in America today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
And in comments just made, I'm glad this comes together this way because I've been wanting to knock. But to that point, with the points just made by the gentleman from New York, who earlier made clear that point, with the points just made by the gentleman from New York, who earlier made clear, because he said it literally, that he will use all means necessary to reverse the Supreme Court, not through the processes of the Supreme Court, but by changing it institutionally, by packing it, by getting rid of the unusual. But to the point just argued, the central holding of Heller is that the Second Amendment confers an individual right. That's Heller. It's what the left went berserk about because you don't want that right to be recognized. Mr. Jones then comes forth, making my argument perhaps better than I can, saying that to see to it that that individual right recognized in Heller no longer continues to apply.
Sir, when did will the gentleman yield?
Let me finish. No, I won't. You opportunity there.
That you are now misconstruing.
The statement has been made by Mr. Cicilline, by Mr. Deutsch, by Mr. Jones, by the President of the United States, that the Second Amendment is not absolute limits. No one has contended that it is without limits. But Heller gives clear indications to what limits are permissible. You read from some of them. What is unlikely falls in the right resolution on that. The Fourth Circuit case earlier, the recognition by the dissent by Judge Wynn in the Fourth Circuit in the same case is that by the Second Amendment first. And the second point is that bans of widely prevalent firearms and acquainted, that's the you can't do that. Another thing Heller said you can't do is require people to lock them up in their homes so they can't be accessed to provide for their, which is the right of self-defense of home and hearth.
The gentleman yield.
No, I will not. I'm going to get this out so that somebody hears it. The President of the United States said the other day,
children can't.
the President said, Homer, or another factually inaccurate point, You couldn't buy a cannon when the Second Amendment was adopted. And actually it's false. It's been debunked repeatedly, but he keeps repeating it. So we can't, I'm making the argument, you attribute to those of us on our side who are raising the question of the constitutionality of what you propose. I do not make the argument that the Second Amendment is absolute, or I make the point about is Heller held what it held. McDonald held what it held. That was the Supreme Court of the United States. Do you acknowledge that baseline or do you not? Mr. Clear repeatedly that he does not. When we've raised these points about what other courts are deciding about the 18 to 20-year-olds being governed by being covered, they have a number one. And number two, that some limitations are impermissible. And those you propose in this bill, 3 of them. I said 2 earlier, I was mistaken. Ban a whole class of weapons to 18 to 20-year-olds, number one. Number two, you want to impose the same kind of disability or disabling requirement mandate in the homes that Heller said is impermissible. And finally, you want to ban magazines that have the number that are predominant, that are prevalent everywhere in the country. Heller said you can't do that. So you've got to contend with why, at least if you say the Ninth Circuit, well, it's great for you guys to cite the Ninth Circuit, you don't respect the Ninth Circuit. Yeah, the Ninth Circuit is liberal. That's why it's so remarkable. Have said that this is something that can't be done. You can't ban a class of weapons to people 18 to 20. So I'm glad to undertake things that we can do. Let's talk about them. Things you can't do, and then you couple that with statements that essentially say, I'm going to get rid of the Second Amendment by any means
Will the gentleman
necessary.
yield?
Yeah, I'll yield to you.
What do you support? Like, what of gun violence in this country? Because you just referenced that, so I would love for you to articulate the efforts that you would be willing to undertake with your Democratic colleagues in this chamber today to stop the epidemic of gun violence.
Look at what's happening, and then you actually do things that would address that.
So you're not going to answer the question because you don't actually have an approach other than to allow the status quo to remain?
Yeah, I wouldn't let teachers prop doors open. The police are not discouraged from going in and saving children who are being assaulted while the assault is going on. I would not intimidate the police and tell them they ought to cease to exist. My time's expired.
That sounds right to me.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Points, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the assertion that Heller prevents us from taking the action that we're taking today is just a misreading of Heller. I'll leave it to the scholars to look at what was struck down in Heller and what we're proposing here. And the reference to the Ninth Circuit is, okay, I understand it's the liberal circuit that my colleagues like to point to for in this case. The fact is there are others who have ruled otherwise. And we all know it's the Supreme Court who has the last word. I know that there are families in the room there. I know that there are families in the room there today who lost loved ones in Newtown. I know that there are people watching all around the country, including a lot of my constituents, 17 families, in fact, whose loved ones, and the 60 families from Las Vegas and 49 families from Orlando and Virginia Tech, 32 people killed. That was in 2007. This idea, this argument that we're rushing to action, that we're not being thoughtful, that we should just take some time to really understand what happened before we respond, we have no interest in ever responding, in ever doing anything to stop this gun violence epidemic in our country. The message that it's sending, you can't sit there, with all due respect to my colleagues, you cannot sit as a member of the House of Representatives and tell my constituents that it's just too soon for us to rush in to figure out what kind of legislation we should pass. We haven't had time to really fully digest what happened in Uvalde or any other mass shooting that has taken place in the more than 4 years since that awful Valentine's Day. And when Mr. Gates talks about what the state legislature did, the way he characterizes it is we all got together and we came up with all kinds of things that we could do that are so radically different here today. In fact, what the Florida legislature did was come together in a bipartisan way and raise the age to buy to 21, to buy any gun to 21. That's what the Florida legislature did. Let's be clear about it. You know what else they did? They passed a red because they understand that if you give law enforcement the ability to take action so that someone who poses a threat to himself shouldn't have a firearm, and that you build in appropriate due process rights. So it just pains all of us. And frankly, anyone who's watching what we're to look at this debate and to be told that Congress is just rushing headlong into doing something without giving it appropriate thought. There are people in my community whom all of you know at this point because they've devoted their lives to honoring the memories of their loved ones who struck down, taken from them at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. They do not deserve to be told that we have to really more time figuring out how to respond to these mass shootings before we can take action. They don't. No other family who's suffering without a loved one, the whole ever. What we're doing here today is reasonable. Anyone who looks at these proposals knows that they're reasonable. And in what's been done in my own state of Florida, run by a Republican legislature and a Republican governor, let's come together and pass this legislation and help to save lives. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. McClintock seek recognition.
Speak on the Shabbat amendment under the 5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I think the reason we don't often hear about mass shootings is that they didn't become mass shootings precisely because they were stopped by a citizen with a gun. As I said earlier, a mass shooting was stopped by a woman with a gun in Charleston, West Virginia, the very day massacre at Uvalde. She couldn't have done that in a so-called gun-free school zone. Is there any other possible way to stop a bad guy with a gun, but with a good way? The only question is how long it takes. It's often been said that police can be there in minutes when seconds count. And what we found in Uvalde and before in part, when the police respond, they don't always act once they get there. Those who are directly threatened by a gunman are those who are in the best position to stop such attack because they're there on the spot in their lives, yet you won't let them. That's stunning to me. Nor do you seem to be serious about enforcing our laws when they're violated. I mean, that's what we've observed time and again from your woke. And if you don't take our laws seriously, what makes you think criminals will? And again, I ask, why hasn't a felon? Remember, his gun, which he illegally obtained by lying on his application, yet another felon, ended up being retrieved from an open trash can 500 feet from school. And I pose the question, what makes you think gun laws will keep guns out of the hands of criminals any better than drug laws keep drugs out of the hands of addicts? MS-13 isn't going to obey your laws. Madmen aren't going to obey, won't obey them either, nor will criminals. All your measures do is make it lawfully impossible for law-abiding citizens to defend themselves. So why won't you protect schools with the same seriousness as we protect our money at the bank? Nobody questions the common sense of having an armed guard at a bank. But leftists somehow cannot see the common sense of having an armed guard. They seem more serious about protecting our money than protecting our children. That's utterly inexplicable to me. And of course, this discussion raises the question of how many bank robberies never happened because guards return fire, and how many attacks on schools can be discouraged when the gunmen know they're likely to be opposed with lethal force at the front door. You know, the left lives in this fantasy world, pass a law against a criminal from obtaining a gun to have it obeyed. Yet, as King Canute demonstrated, there are limits to the efficacy of our laws. The madmen in Uvalde didn't obey them, but everyone else around that gunman did, and that made them defenseless. And so he operated with impunity in an environment where the gunman was king. And he knew that was a safe environment for him to do violence, as his own diary knew no one would be there to return fire. When are my friends going to take the world as it is and not as they wish it to be? The father of modern policing, Sir Robert, once observed that the police are simply the extension of the community, that in fact, the community is the police and the police are the community. Every citizen has a right and a duty to protect themselves. The police are there to help. The only difference, he said, was that the police officer is a professional hired to attend to his duty full-time, not to replace the private citizen, to support him. Mr. Shabbat's amendment makes it more likely an attack can be stopped before it starts and makes it less likely that a gunman will target our schools knowing they can be stopped before they start. Say again, until you're ready to protect our children with force, you're not serious about protecting our children at all. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for purposes of seek recognition.
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really pretty disappointed by some of the rhetoric and arguments that have been advanced today. And I think it's important to just refresh, is now the leading cause of death for the children. America is basically the only country in the world that is mass shootings constantly on a regular basis. Countries that have regulated assault weapons, taken action, don't have solved these problems. Take a look at New Zealand and Australia. You know, we have to do something. Experiencing an unacceptable level of violence because of the prevalence of assault weapons by unstable people, and what is being recommended here, but would do some good. You know, in my own district, we've experienced this trauma. In 2019, at the annual Gilroy Garlic Festival, with an assault weapon, an semi-automatic rifle, killed 3 people and wounded 17 others before killing him. Has strong gun controls, but he went over to Nevada and purchased these weapons and then brought them back to California. That's why we need to have a nationwide. If we can't stop all gun violence through these measures, the common sense provisions in the bill before us today will do some good, save lives. And I just like to say that the recent polling indicates that 89% of Americans support universal background checks, 86% flag laws, and a whopping 70% of Republican and Republican-leaning voters support universal background checks. Know that gun violence can be countered through some of these provisions. You know, I was out listening to constituents in the last, several of my constituents, gun owners, came up to me pleading with me to do something. They pointed out that in their view, it was allow immature individuals, 18, to go out and buy legally assault. That kid can't go out and buy a beer. That kid can't go out and rent a car till he's 5, but we're selling these lethal weapons to him. That's not being the only country on earth where mass shootings are a near daily. Pass the bill before us and to stop talking and throwing dirt in the air and confusing the American people better than that. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back for purposes. Ms. Dean seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, to strike the last word.
Please recognize.
I just wanted to tell a story about how I started my day. It's one of the best ways to start a day. I started it with school students. Abington High School, members of the National Honor Society, 8th, 9th, 10th graders. And they had a series of questions for me. They wanted to know about how I got into this line of work, what inspired me to, guess what? That all got set aside because their first 3, 4, 5 questions were about us. What are we doing to make them safer in school? Doing to make them safer on their playgrounds, in their grocery stores, in their synagogues, in their churches, and on and on and on. These their years, 8th, 9th, 10th graders from Abington School District asked, what are we doing? And I tried to say the very thing we're here to do today, I know it's later than it ever should have been, was to respond to the scourge of gun violence in this country. When I ran for Congress in 2018, I remember going to meeting after meeting, voters, what I care about. I said, I care about the problem of gun violence in this country. I want to do something about it. It is not right that our children are now fearful, don't feel secure in their school. And one father stood up, this was 2018, one father stood up and really hollered at me. He said, you care about gun violence? What do I do with my third? I couldn't fall asleep because they had an active shooter drill and they were coached to find scissors, run and throw scissors, weapons at what are we teaching our children? So I want those Abington High School students to have hope that there are leaders across this dais. Join us. Say that you take this problem seriously. Say that you believe you have to save lives. Stop saying we got to study this some more as the coffins are going in the ground. We don't have to study this. We know. My time to the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Indulgence. And I want to answer her question by saying that we will do something. I'm happy. And I can say that because I have sat in this room, has continued every time in this room, my fellow colleagues, and this insanity continued every time we come to this moment in history. And it continues on the bodies of dead children and dead Americans, not at war, in their homes, their communities, their schools. It is important that we move away from this constant babble. And I beg to differ with the interpretation of my friends, because it is not an interpretation of the Constitution, which is several cases on making it very clear that there are limitations to gun use. It is actually ignoring the fact that we are proud in America of democracy and a Constitution that is alive, that is breathing. That is the argument Mr. Jones was making, but the rejection comes from tone deafness and the sense that continues to have a crowd of people that want to hear insanity. And the reason why it is the case of one of the most conservative jurists in the Heller case, it continues to say it finds support in the historical tradition. This is in the case. Common use at the time finds support in historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual guns. Pages 54 to 56. Or that certain people mentally ill should not have possession of firearms, or that they should not be in sensitive places like schools and government buildings. I already said to Mr. that we can do these things, that they're already able to be done. But this is what I have to contend with in a state that has absolutely no relevant gun laws. And I will recite them: Dallas, Luby's, Walter, Wedgwood, Fort Hood, Second Fort Hood, Dallas Police. This is Texas. Texas First Baptist, Santa Fe, El Paso, Midland, Uvalde. Dead persons, 183 injuries, 153 dead. This is insanity. The pain of Rhonda Hurt because her daughter, the mother of Ethan, doesn't mind me saying, who knows her pain, is that we will do something, and that the Constitution allows us to do something, that the case law allows us to do something. And I would think the names of these dead children and the teachers and her husband, imperative that we do something, ensures that we must do something. We will join that babbling of insanity if we do not choose to do that. We will do something. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll. Clerk will not call the roll. At this time, the committee will take a brief 15-minute recess.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chairman, can you get mine? Don't want to run over you.